Does a lot of fantasy feel the same to you? Have you gone to a library or bookstore, browsed available games, or tried a show or movie that's fantasy-focused, and felt that it was all far too similar? Maybe you've wondered before if these feelings of fatigue and sameness are all in your head, or if this is just the current reality. And if it is real, what's causing it? What can I as a reader, a viewer, audience member, or even as a writer do about it? Hello. I'm Connor Barlow, and welcome to the Book Bin, or welcome back if you're a returning guest. Today we're seated around the bin to discuss the topic of fantasy's issue with sameness and how to solve that problem together. Now, this might feel like a sudden shift from my previous video, which if you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to, in which we discussed the importance of folklore and myth in the fantasy genre and how those elements should be used. You may be asking, Kano, did you not encourage this sameness? And the answer is no. I will elaborate in this video on why and help you as an audience member to a particular piece of media or as a writer figure on how to navigate these issues. Let's start by answering one of the questions I posed at the beginning of this video. Is the sameness of fantasy real or in your head? The answer is unfortunately likely to frustrate many of you because the answer is yes and no. Now, I'm not here to leave you without any explanation, of course. The reality is there's a lot of creativity in the world, and there's so many types of fantasy media that it's impossible for every single one to be identical in a way that would exhaust the mind inherently. That said, there is an issue in which the most popular, accessible, and marketed fantasy is suffering from sameness, or as is becoming known to the fantasy literary community as generic fantasy. Generic fantasy is a term that can describe both positive and negative things. It's not in and of itself a bad thing. Some good examples of what generic fantasy can bring to a fantasy story is familiarity and comfort, working to solve problems with lore dumping and excess exposition. Think of my folklore video, in which using the key traits of the Fae make Fae characters in a story easier to understand with less expository explanation. However, generic fantasy is a double-edged sword and has its own issues. Generic fantasy can often be seen as uninspired or even lazy to the audience, and can often provide gaps, holes, or other unexplained or underdeveloped features that will confuse, annoy, or worst of all, bore the audience. In essence, generic fantasy doesn't tread any new ground or innovate ideas, and that will lead to an unengaged or even upset audience who is looking for something new. Where do we see generic fantasy? Well, it's honestly everywhere, but let me give you some examples of where the worst forms of generic fantasy lie, or aspects of generic fantasy that can even falsely bleed into interesting fantasy. This data is focused on books, with a side note on games, but I'm sure you can see this in other mediums of expression like movies, games, shows, etc. One of the really big problems that cause the generic fantasy sameness is honestly probably just the bestsellers list. This issue isn't actually unique to fantasy, and you can see it over decades and generations of readers how the bestsellers will have several years of consistent generic traits until the next trend comes along. Even whole genres rise and fall in bestsellers lists. There are a lot of books published with the goal of getting on these bestseller lists, which try their best to copy popular conventions rather than innovate. You see this a lot nowadays with trope marketing and other similar conventions. There's even a few articles addressing the issue of how book covers all look the same. This one can even sometimes mask unique fantasy literature as generic if the cover follows popular norms and conventions rather than trying to innovate and explore creatively. One of the articles of my study, which focuses on TTRPGs like D&D, has a good list of traits that go with generic fantasy that I think apply across most mediums to some extent. The article first makes mention that generic fantasy makes a world more accessible to audiences that want to get their hands on it. This can be effective and valuable for people who want to roleplay or explore the world themselves with their own writing, but when attempting to tell a controlled, centralized story, as a writer, these worlds can be hard to work with while keeping audiences interested. They then list key traits of generic fantasy that I think are worth relaying here. 1. Generic fantasy is typically a medieval Euro fantasy, in which the fantasy world is based on a medieval or Middle Age inspired fantasy idea of European cultures, often far removed from actual history of the time periods and culture. 2. Tolkien's influence is incredibly pervasive in the modern fantasy genre across many mediums. Many people are understandably inspired by his work and so try to have depictions of fantasy that emulate it in some way. Many attribute Tolkien for the modern view of fantasy and even the Middle Ages in general as a result of his work, so it's no surprise that a lot of stuff feels derived from him. 3. The influence of D&D to fantasy cannot be denied either, especially if you focus on things like video games and TTRPGs. Even the concept of health bars, stamina, or mana, and so many spells and magic systems are recycled from D&D over the years, which inevitably also bleeds into other mediums. While we can never really get rid of the reality of generic content across mediums in any genre, by recognizing where and why these things occur, we can begin to explore what we as writers and audience members can do to find new things and to broaden our creativity and consumption. The next sections are going to be what to do as a writer and what to do as a reader or just an audience member in general if it's not books. I would encourage you to watch both sections rather than just skipping to whichever is more relevant to you. By learning how each realm operates, you will increase your own knowledge and understanding as a whole. So let's figure out what writers can do to solve the generic issue. As a writer, it is your responsibility to research and study storytelling conventions in the fantasy genre and practice the ability of balancing the familiar with the new. You need to be able to try new things and explore new grounds, but you want to be cautious about going too far into unexplored areas. I'll be providing you some of the common pitfalls and problems that happen in general with writing, in fantasy writing, and also in the bestseller generic fantasy you see coming out right now. First, make sure to really focus on always improving your writing quality and take the time to freshen up your grammar and syntax. This is important because there are many writers with pitfalls in poor writing quality, noted in multiple sources as well as opinion pieces and forums. While it may seem odd that bestsellers are prone to poor writing quality, consider that a lot of bestsellers are trying to hop on popular trends as quickly as possible, and so have very minimal quality checking by writers, editors, and publishers. The goal of these books is to be purchased, not as much to be read. The authors may be genuine in wanting you to read their work, but don't get me wrong, the ultimate goal for a lot of the bestsellers is focusing on the trend from a marketing and publishing perspective, and it's money over substance. In addition to that, avoid immature writing. By this, I mean if you have an audience in mind within a certain age range, you need to identify what style of writing is suitable for them. This is seen most of all in adult fantasy and fiction. A lot of authors were inspired by the boom of YA in the 2010s. That's not a bad thing, but many of these same authors have gone on to write adult novels inspired by YA, which can often lead to the text being kind of jarring in its tone and word choice. Make sure that when you're writing for a certain age range, that you're making sure the wording and tone of your writing match that age range. Second, avoid trope writing. Now, let me put a big disclaimer here before we continue. Tropes aren't bad, in fact, they're useful tools for a writer to utilize. By understanding certain character, plot, or genre conventions and expectations, you can leverage your reader's understanding to bring about familiar emotions and patterns that readers can identify that they like. The problem isn't that tropes exist in your work. The problem is when you focus on writing the trope more than writing the story or character arcs, and your focus on your own book is more about its tropes rather than what story you want to tell. A lot of bestseller-focused books and in book marketing, in general this decade, focus on what tropes appear in a book, and you'll notice very quickly it's the same few tropes that keep appearing again and again, and you'll find that those books often feel the same because they're doing the same things, using the same tropes, and focusing more on those tropes than a compelling story. This is called trope fatigue and hits readers often, which is why every decade or so you'll see popular subgenres and tropes shift. One on its own might be fun, but when you dive into all of them, it can become a bit much. be mindful of that in your own writing. In addition to that, consider how you can make those same tropes unique. Again, tropes are not inherently bad, it's how you use them that matters. A few suggestions on how to use a common trope without being generic include twisting tropes, layering complexity, subverting expectations, and more. For example, if you twist the trope, what you're doing is taking something familiar to the reader, but trying something new they won't expect. Say you're planning on to do a trope where true love's kiss breaks the curse. Perhaps the kiss comes from an unexpected place or even from the person themselves on their own body as a symbolic act of self-love. If you layer complexity, you're taking your characters with a trope and expanding beyond it. Say you have the dumb, plucky side character who isn't the brightest but is very positive, until you realize as a reader they're constantly on the verge of crumbling because they carry the burdens of all of those around them, and their personality is more of a mask than just a generic trait for them to bear. If you subvert expectations, you're placing a trope on a silver platter in front of the reader, but when you reveal the meal, they realize it's something entirely different. Back to the true love's kiss. Perhaps the prince finds the princess and awakens Sleeping Beauty with true love's kiss, only to discover that she's an even worse villain than the previous one, and the prince realizes the villain who cursed the princess was trying to protect the world from doomsday by subduing her. Essentially, there's many other ways you can play with tropes without making them boring and generic. I'll include some of my research in the description, where I also have some tools about how to avoid or revitalize common fantasy tropes for your writing. Third and fourth, balance your writing and don't go meandering or rush your story. This one is difficult, takes a lot of practice, but while both are related, they can show up in very different ways. Many stories take way too much time on small things that don't move the plot forward, especially in flashbacks that can sometimes feel like they're providing information, but in reality aren't. Taking too long to even get to the plot at the beginning is the worst, but it can also frustrate and bore readers if you take too long to get to plot points throughout the whole book as well, which can make your work blend in with other fantasy books and create an idea that the work is generic even if it maybe isn't. By contrast, many fantasy books have a lot of fast-paced scenes, especially action scenes, but the same problem remains. There's nothing actually propelling the story forward, and these action scenes are repetitive and don't actually accomplish anything. If you realize that your main plot would stay the same if you cut out 3 action scenes, then those action scenes don't need to be there, or they need to tie into your plot much better. This can make things feel rushed and stalled all at once, and your readers will once again be bored or frustrated, and it will make your work fall into the haze of other fantasy books and to be labeled as, or mislabeled as, generic. Fifth, and I'm sorry to say this one because I love this convention and use it myself in some of my current writing, is too many POVs for no reason. This has become a trope in fantasy all on its own, and is so common despite not having much justification to back it up. When you're writing, try to stick to one POV only. However, if you realize that crucial information is being lost when you don't include a certain perspective, then incorporate that specific perspective. Every time you add a new POV, ask yourself critically if this character's voice is worth their own POV being shown, or if there's a way to incorporate that information into a pre-existing perspective. What value does this character add? Are they even interesting enough for a POV? Too many will confuse and bore readers, and seeing so many can turn a lot of readers off if they identify any of the POVs as unjustified. Best to avoid multiple perspectives without thorough reasoning. Sixth, and I'm also sorry to say, is info dumping. As a world-building fanatic, this one makes me sad because I like lore dumping, but I recognize that I am a minority with a lot of readers. That doesn't mean any sharing of world-building or lore is bad, mind you, but the longer it goes on and the less directly tied into the plot it is, the more readers get bored. A lot of unpracticed and quick-to-publish trend writing tend to struggle with this, and there can be long-winded explanations in the middle of scenes that stall the scene, bore the reader, and make the action of the scene confusing with their presence. Basically, you need to practice communicating information about your world and work as briefly as possible. Readers' eyes glaze over if there's too much info dumping, and even if the idea is unique, it'll quickly blend in with a lot of other fantasy worlds because the reader will want to skip it to get back to the good stuff. but that big block of info might stick out in their memory as being memorably frustrating while retaining none of its info. Seventh is having one-dimensional characters. One thing that can cause trouble for authors who want to quickly put out bestsellers in fantasy is that they often have to sacrifice on having characters with depth, which will be especially detrimental to your protagonist and any antagonists you have in the work. When characters are one-dimensional, they will often be little more than just tropes or single noteworthy traits that make them all blend together for a reader engaged in the fantasy genre. You want to give your characters complexity, both in their motivations and ideals, but also in the small things like interests, what they like and dislike, talents and skills, but also in drawbacks, weaknesses, negative traits. You want to consider not just the big picture plot needs your character needs to fill, but who they are as a person to make your character stand out. Finally, having too much fantasy with not enough reason. Now, don't get me wrong, when someone is reading or writing a fantasy, you want it to actually feel fantastical, but you also want to have a reason behind each fantasy element that exists. The different things to consider are too much made-up fantasy for no reason. We'll talk about this more in a future video, but basically just consider if the made-up words are always necessary, if this invented concept actually serves the world and makes it richer or forwards the story, or if it's just something that will be a learning barrier about the world to the reader and will bore them. A lot of fantasy books that blend together tend to be haphazard about this, and so none of these unique fantasy traits actually make them stand out because the fantasy element is random and forgettable since it wasn't as thought out or intentionally implemented. Sometimes even the writer forgets them and you're like, wait, why did this one topic come up early in the book? And now it's different later in the book. You just want to keep those things in mind. There's plenty of other ways to keep your writing from blending in with all the other fantasies out there, but these are pretty loaded as is and really good places to start. When drafting and editing, consider each of these and make sure to put the work in to make your project stand out while not hitting those pitfalls. Now that we've discussed what writers can do, let's quickly discuss what readers can do, because there are options there for you, and I think that doesn't get covered as often as it could. I'm as much of a reader as I am a writer, so I want to provide tips both from research and from my own experience that could help you as a fantasy reader not run into the same things over and over in your reading. This list is shorter than for writers, but it's not empty. There are a few things readers can do to help promote positive change while also getting more enjoyment out of their reading. These first few things you can do are all tied together and run in tandem. First, consider stepping away from bestsellers and trending books for a while. A lot of the problems with sameness in any genre, as mentioned, tend to fall more on marketing and books published quickly to follow a trend and get as many sales as possible. On an individual level, you might feel powerless against trends in any medium, but if you encourage others like you to join, your buying power significantly increases, and you can tell the market that a certain trend is not going to get your money in and of itself. Encourage variety by flexing your buying power wisely. Related to that, consider new places to seek out new books. There's a few places you can do that, and I'd say a pretty big one is your local library or bookstore, and talking to the librarian or staff to learn what kinds of hidden gems may exist. People who have made their job related to books are more than likely going to be able to point you in the direction of titles you've never even heard of that you'll love, and they can really get to learn what your interests are in a genre and find things tailor-made for you. Another way that's related is to support indie artists and authors. One way to do that is by looking in indie spaces for publishing, including places like Smashwords or bookshop.org. Seek out smaller writers who are just looking for their audience. A fun way to do this would be by signing up to sites like Booksprout or Book Sirens, where indie authors upload their books to read for free in return for an honest review. This will definitely expand what you find out there and allows you to both give back to the author and to readers like you who are searching for something new to get their hands on. Finally, this one might be a bit hard for people to accept, but you need to read other genres. A big part of why fantasy books all blend together is because if that's all you read, that's all you get. Genres don't massively change within just a year, the trends will change over decades at a time, and every genre has its own conventions, tropes, and norms. If you're burned out by fantasy and everything feels the same, put down fantasy books for a while and try other genres, even ones you haven't liked in the past. You want to see how other authors and other genres do things, what their approaches are, and maybe you'll find things you didn't expect to like. Side note, authors should always be readers, and this is just as important for fantasy authors to do as a typical reader. Writers exploring other genres in their reading can expand their understanding of writing, and you can bring elements in from other genres to enrich your fantasy work by using it. Basically, as a reader, you need to expand where you find your books and what books you're reading. I think if you can do both of these things, you'll find that books won't feel as generic or the same as you did before. Well, this was a pretty loaded topic, but I hope you were able to get something out of it and find what you needed to enhance your writing or even your reading. We all play a role in the book industry, and we all have power to influence what we write and read, so hopefully these tips can help you get in the right direction. What are your thoughts on sameness in books? What are some challenges you've run into, and what solutions have you found that I didn't cover? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your own experiences with the ups and downs of the fantasy genre and its trends. With all that wrapped up, let me just say thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed. If you had a good time, please feel welcome to subscribe, leave a like, a hype, all that stuff, and I hope to see you back at the book bin soon.